Welcome on into the Wolverine.com podcast. Clayton Safey here on a Monday. We're talking Michigan football, a little bit different this week with Michael Cohen of foxsports.com. He's a national college football and basketball writer, but we get into a bunch of preseason topics, his expectations for Michigan, where do they fit in the Big Ten, the quarterback battle, what made last year's team so special, the transition to the Sherrone Moore era, and more with Michael Cohen of Fox Sports. Make sure to like this video if you're watching on YouTube. Subscribe to our YouTube channel as well as we climb towards 30,000 subscribers. And most importantly, head to thewolverine.com. Right now, you can use the promo code UM1 for 2 months of premium access for just $1. So you get all of our premium content, recruiting scoop, Michigan football, basketball, recruiting intel at thewolverine.com. Again, the promo code UM1 for 2 months of premium access for just $1. And finally, the 2024 Michigan Football Preview Magazine is coming out and will ship in July. You can head to thewolverineondemand.com to get your issue. Description is also in the bio to the video and the podcast. You can pre-order right now before June 17th at a discount. So make sure to do that. You're going to get it anyway. Might as well pre-order it and get that process out of the way. It'll ship to you. You'll forget about it. It'll show up one day at your door. Next thing you know, you'll be at the beach, reading your Michigan Football Preview Magazine, which has Will Johnson on the cover. It's 160 pages of analysis, columns, exclusive interviews, and more in the 160-page 2024 Michigan Football Preview Magazine, which you can order at thewolverineondemand.com. Pre-order today. But without further ado, here's Michael Cohen of Fox Sports. All right, we now welcome on a very special guest, Michael Cohen of Fox Sports, one of the good dudes in the industry that I've come across. Loved our time on the Michigan beat together. He still shows up, obviously, quite a bit with Michigan being in the spotlight, but former Michigan beat writer for the Detroit Free Press as well. But yeah, just always enjoyed talking. Some of the fun part of doing this job is kind of just the downtime, when you're waiting for Jim Harbaugh to come out, or now Sherrone Moore or some of the players, and you're talking to the other dudes like a Michael Cohen. So Mike, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, no problem. I don't know who else I would have talked with about Curb Your Enthusiasm every Monday morning as we were waiting for Jim Harbaugh to come up. That was always a highlight of the week.
Absolutely. I did want to ask you about that, actually, the finale at the end. So we'll save the Curb talk, but absolutely some great combos about that. Michael, I wanted to start with this because you have a really unique perspective on Michigan football the last few years. You were, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you came in, covered Michigan in 2021, about halfway through 2022. You leave for a bigger job with Fox Sports, now covering more teams than just Michigan. But, and then there we are. I remember during overtime, we were standing, I think, darn near right next to each other at the Rose Bowl as things were going down there at the end, and an instant classic. But when you were covering Michigan in 2021 and 2022, did you think that they were going to be able to eventually make that climb and become national champions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It was kind of fascinating because I got there a few weeks before the 2021 season started, as you noted, and as I'm sure you remember, that was a time where nobody really knew what that team was going to be like. It was coming out of the pandemic where they had been 2-4 and really struggled, and everybody was talking about Harbaugh's salary and Harbaugh's future, and Cade McNamara versus this true freshman JJ McCarthy, and nobody even really knew if Hassan Haskins was going to be what Hassan Haskins became at that point. So I didn't really know what to expect. And to be honest, I kind of thought I would be covering a team that would go, maybe 8-4, maybe 9-3 if things went really, really well. But I didn't know. And I grew up in a different part of the country on the East Coast. So of course I was aware of Michigan football, but in terms of the ins and outs of what Jim Harbaugh's tenure had been like, I had to really do a lot of research on that because I was more familiar with Jim from a previous job I had covering the NFL when I covered the Green Bay Packers. And, I got to be around when Jim was just leaving the 49ers. So I was more familiar with his imprint on the NFL than anything. And so I did not think that they would necessarily get all the way to winning the national title. They certainly exceeded my expectations in 2021. In 2022, I thought they were really good, but I didn't think that they would be good enough. And ultimately that proved to be the case, just falling maybe a game and a half short of winning a national title. And then in 2023, they exceeded my expectations again, because I was still skeptical that they would be able to get over the hump. But what really impressed me, and what partially led to, I think, Sherrone Moore getting the head coaching job, is just how good they were in the trenches against, the likes of teams from the SEC and teams that they have to, contend with, where it quote unquote just means more, and all these things you hear in college football. I was just so impressed with the player development that Michigan had, especially in the trenches, and the way they dominated at the line of scrimmage en route to winning the national championship. So it was a fascinating time to be in Ann Arbor and be around that team. And like I said, they certainly exceeded my expectations, and I did not expect them to win the national championship. I have no problem admitting that. And they thoroughly, thoroughly deserved it with how well they played last season. That was easily, I don't want to say easily, that was definitely the best team in the country by the end of the season. I don't think there were any doubts about it.
Yeah, no, there's no question. And over the weekend, I watched the BTN and 60 version of the Nebraska game and the Minnesota game, kind of those back-to-back road games. And that's kind of when you started to feel that they might have something. We knew they had something special because of the last 2 years and all the guys that came back, but something maybe a little extra special. And then to actually improve throughout the year and win some of the big games down the stretch was a completely different task, right? So it's one thing to look good against teams that are middling in the Big Ten, but you went somewhere with the line of scrimmage, where I wanted to go next, because you and I were both there in Miami when Michigan got absolutely dominated by Georgia. And I think that, looking back at the 3-year climb that Michigan went on, you kind of, there are these different snapshots. And one of them is when Jordan Davis comes out for the coin toss against Michigan. And I think Andrew Vastardis was a captain. It was like, wait a minute, what the hell's going on here? Like, who is this guy? Obviously you'd watched him, and, we had prepared for that game, from a coverage standpoint and everything else, but it's different when you see it in person, and then for them to dominate that game. But then for Michigan to then actually close that gap, and against Alabama, Alabama played well, I thought, at the line of scrimmage at different points, but it was Michigan that kind of controlled the line of scrimmage and had more guys, and Kenneth Grant and Mason Graham and guys like that looked like Alabama players or Georgia players of years past.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned earlier how we were next to each other at the Rose Bowl down at field level, especially for overtime there at the end of that game. And, I realized that not a lot of people will have the opportunity to watch a college football game or a pro football game from the sideline. But as somebody who never played football myself, and my high school in Connecticut didn't even have a team when I was there, I'm always blown away by just how physical football is when you're down at ground level and you're looking at the line of scrimmage. And so when you could see Mason Graham or Kenneth Grant just like smashing into guys, or the other way around, the Alabama offensive linemen just lowering their shoulders and just going after guys, like, it is a violent, violent sport. And so, like you said, for Michigan to be able to close the gap at the point in football where it is the most violent, the most physical, the most manhandling, like, that to me was really, really impressive. And obviously we can go through a long list of reasons why that was the case, starting at the top with Jim Harbaugh's persona and leadership, Ben Herbert, the director of strength and conditioning, playing a huge role in that. But also, I think just the commitment of guys to stay at Michigan for 3 and 4 and 5 years, and maybe even 6 for some of them to use that extra COVID year. I think a huge part of their success was convincing guys that just because you don't play early doesn't mean you have to leave, and that you can still be a hugely impactful player in this program later. And you look at a guy like Michael Barrett, who went the full range of the spectrum from being, super important early in his career to being totally irrelevant when Mike McDonald got there, to then being super important again by the time he's with Jesse Minter for year 2 of Jesse Minter. That's a great example of a guy. Or going into this next season, I'm sure we're going to talk about the 2024 team in a bit, so I won't go too deep into it, but a guy like Quentin Johnson at safety is finally going to get his chance after being in the program for I think this is going to be his 5th year, and he's now just maybe going to crack into the starting rotation. So I think that's one of the big elements of culture, and that's a word that's thrown around a lot and overused, but the strength of Michigan's culture, I think, in the last few years was the toughness, the work ethic, and then the willingness to stick around in pursuit of the larger goal, rather than guys just jumping in the portal and looking either for immediate playing time or a payday or both. And that's not to say that guys at Michigan haven't gotten paid, because some of them certainly have. But I think they've done a better job of convincing guys that this was the place you came out of high school. There's a reason you committed here. Why don't you see it through? Because eventually you're going to get your chance if you follow the building blocks and follow the roadmap that these guys before you have laid out. And that's the biggest reason, I think, why they've been able to close that gap.
No, I think you make a number of great points right there. And the other thing is, and this is something I wrote about right after the season, is like I don't think Michigan wins that national championship last year if they beat TCU and then maybe lose to Georgia. I think some of the guys wouldn't have come back because they thought, okay, we got over this hump that we couldn't get over the year before against Georgia. But instead, they lose in heartbreaking fashion. They all come back, for the most part, and you were pretty much upgraded at most positions, and you had all this depth because those guys stayed around. So Kenneth Grant didn't start a game last year, I don't think. Maybe one or two if they were in some sort of heavy package or something, but without pulling up, anything right now on the fly, I don't think he did, and which is ridiculous to think about. For one example, so I agree. It was kind of the perfect storm of all of that, and the culture certainly was there and super strong. And it seems like the culture now, when you talk to guys, I was out last week at Will Johnson's camp talking to some players, and all of them, and it's funny, Kenneth Grant, actually, to mention him for a third time today, he said that practices now are more physical than they were under Jim Harbaugh, and I just started laughing. I mean, how is that possible? He said, yeah, it seems like we do a little bit more. He's like, it seems like we work a little bit more on football now. And I was like, I mean, this is like ridiculous to hear. But Sherrone Moore is kind of doing it the Jim Harbaugh way, which is also his way, though, I think. So sometimes it's like, all right, is he going to mold things in maybe the image that he wants them in? And is that going to be different than Jim Harbaugh? And it's like, well, I think they're pretty similar in that way. But to go back to my original point, the culture from you talking to every single guy you talk to sounds like it's the same. I guess, what have you seen from this Michigan program since Sherrone Moore has taken over?
Well, what sort of interests me the most, and I know you and Anthony talked about this on a podcast you guys recorded last week, but just this idea that kind of, when Sherrone has had to be out in public over the last few months, a lot of it has been addressing issues, and issues can be positive or negative. I know sometimes that word has a purely negative connotation, but it could be a positive issue, like how are you going to lead this program for the first time now that you're in the big chair officially? It could be a negative issue, like what's gone on with, losing two members of his staff to off-field issues and things like that. What are they going to do in the transfer portal? Are they going to bring in another quarterback? And so you guys had a chance, or I can't remember if it was you or Anthony that went out to the recruiting event last week, but you had a chance to see him talk to some high school kids. And, I think it was described on your podcast as saying like he was in his element, and it seemed like he didn't feel like there was a lot of pending issues that he needed to talk about anymore. And so that's kind of what I'm most curious about going into fall camp. Is so much of the last few months has been Sherrone wanting to kind of stay in the background and put all of the attention on his players and let them take the shine for things. And while that's very different than Jim Harbaugh, just because Jim Harbaugh by nature made headlines wherever he went and whatever he said and whatever he did, I'm curious to see how long that continues for, because at some point, whether Sherrone wants to be that guy or not, like he is the head coach of a top 5, 6, 7 program in college football in terms of most prestige and most recognition around the country. And eventually that puts you in the spotlight, whether you want to be there or not. And so I'm wondering if, as he gets a little bit more comfortable with it, will he open up a little bit more? Will he start to tell some stories and things the way that Harbaugh would at times? Or is he going to really try and make this like purely about the guys? And so he's going to stay quieter and a little bit more closed off and a little bit more matter of fact. So I guess to sort of put a bow on that, what I'm getting at is I'm curious to see how he grows into the role of the public image of the job, because he got that little 4-week taste of it last year when Jim Harbaugh was suspended, first at the beginning of the season and then toward the end of the regular season. But now it's 365 days a year in the big chair. And I'm curious if he'll start to open up to that a little bit. Will he use his voice to advocate for certain things across the sport the way Jim Harbaugh did? Or is he just going to stay sort of the way he is now, a little bit in the background, let the players and the play speak for itself, and go from there? So how he evolves, how he grows into his role, especially as wins and losses actually start to happen. Obviously, you can be more comfortable the more you're winning. You might be a little bit more uptight or a little nervous if there are some losses on the resume. So his maturation as a head coach, I think, is the most fascinating thing for me, moving from spring to summer and then into fall camp and the regular season.
I've thought a lot about that over the last few months. And then every time I'm thinking about that, and like you just laid out there, I thought really well. But then you think of, well, what do you compare his situation to? Because nobody takes over a program that just won the national championship. I mean, even the fact that, like you mentioned, the the 4-week, what did Word Manual call it? Like an audition for the job as well. Like, it's such a unique circumstance that he takes over. And in this era of college football, you can't really compare it. So I agree. Once the games start and you get a little bit of rhythm to the season, I think we'll see more maybe what what him being the face of the program looks like. You wrote an article, to switch gears a little bit, recently about the top newcomer for every Big Ten team. And as somebody who's writing previews for Michigan's opponents here for our preview magazine, I appreciate this because there are so many new names. I'm currently working on the Washington preview right now. They have 2 returning starters. Everyone's different. It's like Jed Fish brought Arizona over to Washington. So it's really hard to track, but it's a great article just to look at, okay, who's going to be the new guy. And I know you provided some bonuses as well of other guys on these teams that are going to be new faces that'll make impacts. But you put Jaishawn Barham, the junior linebacker for Michigan, a Maryland transfer who is really athletic, a guy who wreaked a little bit of havoc against Michigan last year, intercepting J.J. McCarthy in the end zone, kind of made that thing a game at halftime. What do you think he's going to bring to the table for Michigan?
Yeah, I think the inside linebacker position last year was probably not talked about enough in terms of how good it was and how stable it was for Michigan, because part of that, I think, is due to the fact that Junior Colson is such a quiet guy. Like, he's just not a loud and boisterous personality. Even when he would make like an amazing play on the field or a great tackle, like, he was never the type to just go nuts with his celebration or anything. And so I think the combination of him and Michael Barrett, with Michael Barrett obviously being such an old and mature guy and had all the poise and everything to go with it, I just don't think there was as much flash or pizzazz from those 2 guys as they probably could have gotten away with given the quality and caliber of their play. So I think Barham is going to be a huge part of this defense, because you need somebody in the middle that can really communicate between the first level, meaning the trenches, and the third level, meaning the secondary. And when you look at the way he played in the spring game, like with a lot of violence and a lot of aggressiveness, and then you hear the way that Sherrone Moore has talked about him throughout the spring. I think it was maybe his post-spring news conference where I wasn't able to attend, but you sent me the audio, so I appreciate that. And I was listening to it, and he basically said this is a guy that like doesn't really talk a whole lot and doesn't say much, but he's constantly going to work, constantly going about his business, and doing all the kinds of things that you used to hear people ascribe to Junior Colson when they talked about the way that he carried himself. And so I just think the combination of him and Ernest Hausman is probably about as good as Michigan could have hoped for when you have to replace 2 starting linebackers that both played like, I think it's at least 585 or almost 600 snaps, the 2 of them last year. So I think he's going to be a key piece of this defense. I think he's really athletic. I think he brings the experience and the tenacity and nastiness that new defensive coordinator Wink Martindale will be looking for. So I think he's going to be a key piece of this team. And then the other reason why I picked him is because, and this is part of the storyline, I think, of this team, is they just didn't bring in the same level of impact transfer necessarily as they did going into the 2023 season, when they had to remake that offensive line a little bit. When they brought in, I know this was a later addition, but bringing in a starting corner from UMass late in the cycle and Josh Wallace, I just didn't think there were as many impact guys coming in. And part of that is because of what we talked about earlier. They convinced some guys to come back and stick around and didn't need a ton of replacements other than the offensive side of the ball, which is obviously going to be almost completely redone. But the defense has key pieces at the first level and the third level already. And so I think if they can find the glue guy that meshes them together, and if that's Jaishawn Barham in the middle, I think he's going to have a really big year for Michigan.
It's funny, when he committed back in December, we probably didn't cover it. I'm speaking for myself here, as to the extent that we should have, because Michigan was gearing up for the college football playoff. And same with Josh Preeb. I mean, he committed we were on Pacific Coast time. It's like you wake up and it's like, this kid committed. And then it turns out, wait, this guy's seems like a hell of an offensive lineman that'll start at left guard for Michigan this year. But, when he committed, I remember breaking him down and looking at what he did, and he played some edge rusher. Like, he's athletic enough to do that, go after the passer. Now, with I'd say lack of depth at linebacker, it's pretty clear he's going to spend his time at middle linebacker. But with how aggressive Wink Martindale is, he's going to get his fair share of opportunities to rush the passer, I think, and get after guys a little bit. And, so I think that's going to be an interesting aspect of what he does as well. And something Junior Colson could do, Mike Barrett could certainly do as well. So I think some good parallels there. And then you wrote about this as well, the defensive back haul, I guess you could say, that Michigan gets. And, I think it was a 48-hour span, correct me if I'm wrong, that, they got 4 different defensive backs: Aamir Hall, corner from Albany, 2 safeties, Wesley Walker from Tennessee / Louisville-ish, spent a semester there. Jaden Mangum from Michigan State, which took a lot of the headlines. Ricky Johnson seems like an insurance type of guy from UNLV, maybe add some depth if, break glass in case of emergency type of thing. But Michigan clearly had to do something, I think, with Rod Moore going down. They were looking for a corner going back to December, weren't able to land him. Now they get 2. But Aamir Hall really intrigues me out of Albany. Sherrone Moore talked last week when we were there in Detroit about him being very similar in demeanor to Josh Wallace. And, I think he could be a similar type of impact guy for Michigan this year. You got Will Johnson on one side. You have Jair Hill, who I think they like, but he's inexperienced. But then you have an FCS All-American in Aamir Hall that can come in and make a big impact.
Yeah, so one of the reasons I wrote that story about the secondary is because, generally if a team feels that it has a need at a position or a position group, what we've seen out of this modern landscape of college football is if they're going to address that need in the transfer portal, a lot of times the marquee guys are going in between that first and second semester, so kind of December, January, so that they can get enrolled by January and go through spring practice at their new school and everything that goes along with making that transition. So the fact that Michigan didn't do that, now I know the Rod Moore injury happened during spring ball, so that's not something that this coaching staff could have or would have anticipated in any way. But the fact that they went so heavy on the secondary after spring ball sort of made me think that they probably thought there were guys that would make bigger jumps in the spring than they did. And that's not to knock anyone on the roster, but generally speaking, if you're going out and adding 4 guys at one position group in the spring, that either suggests that you lost a bunch of guys in the spring due to injury or the portal, which Michigan really didn't, because other than Rod Moore, that was pretty much the only significant loss that they had in terms of guys that were likely to be in the rotation that they didn't already know about ahead of time, with obviously Keon Sabb being one of those guys that I mentioned that enrolled in Alabama in time to play in spring. So they already knew about that. But then if you're adding all these guys at the end, it kind of suggests like they wanted to go through spring. They thought maybe guys would make a jump, or they thought guys would be a little bit farther along than they were. And then it didn't happen. So they had to go out and either get depth pieces or guys that they think can be potential starters. And so I think Hall is absolutely the most interesting one, as you mentioned. The success that they had with Josh Wallace last year from UMass coming in late was really important to them, especially because when you think about what Josh Wallace was and what he wasn't, you guys have talked about this. I remember, Chris Ballas talking about this on the podcast with you many times about how, Wallace was never going to blow anybody away with physical traits. He wasn't a 4.4 burner. He wasn't a guy with a 40-inch vertical leap. He was just a smart, sound, experienced football player that could do a job, and you could scheme around him to cover up any of the weaknesses that he might have had. Now, obviously, it's going to be potentially even a bigger jump in competition for a guy like Aamir Hall coming from an FCS level school. But you look at what Jared Verse did a number of years ago, going from Albany to Florida State and then becoming a first-round pick in this year's NFL draft. There is a lineage there, albeit a limited one, of guys going from that program, an established and well-respected FCS program, to bigger schools and making an impact. And I think this cornerback 2 situation is really one of the storylines to watch in fall camp when you look at the depth chart specifically, because everybody knows Will Johnson is going to take his side and he's going to lock it down and nobody's going to have to worry about that side of the field. But on the other side, if you don't have a number 2 corner that you love, then it starts to influence what you do with your safeties and what types of coverages you can play, because you may need to cover up some things or you may need to help a guy in certain situations. So I think the competition between Jair Hill and Aamir Hall and Jaden McBurrows and Zeke Berry and anybody they might want to try at this perimeter corner spot, or even guys that can rotate through into the nickel, that's really intriguing to me. But what this secondary looks like outside of basically Makari Page and Will Johnson is really interesting to me, because I think even though Quentin Johnson has experience in terms of the years that he's been in school, he's still relatively unproven in terms of a game in and game out type of production. Number 2 corner, they don't really know what they have yet in terms of somebody that's shown it in a game setting. And then nickel, obviously, I don't think anyone's going to be able to play at the level that Mike Sanders did last year. I think he was playing at such an incredible high level that it would be almost impossible to live up to that. But that's another position that they have to sort out. So other than Will Johnson and Makari Page, I think how this secondary shakes out and how many guys they feel comfortable cycling through is going to be really important to watch, especially in a year where their schedule has some more difficult games earlier in the year than what Michigan has faced the last couple of seasons.
Yeah, I mean, some of the games early last year, they didn't really have to worry about the other quarterback throwing. Even when they got into the Big Ten schedule, Heinrich Harburg and, Ethan Kaliak-Manis weren't exactly scaring you. Josh Wallace, was able to kind of ease in and get that transition. Now it's going to be Quinn Ewers. It's going to be, whoever USC's quarterback is, probably Miller Moss. And then Washington, we know with Jed Fish, even though it's not Kalen DeBoer, they're still going to throw the football. They have a good quarterback who's second all-time in SEC passing yards, and Will Rogers. So agree with you on that. And it was huge to add depth. And they don't have Mikey Sanders still anymore, not just in the nickel, but as a emergency corner, like we saw late in the Ohio State game when Will Johnson goes down and he was able to step in there. You slide somebody else in like McBurrows to nickel, and they were able to close that game out. Very thin ice there at the end when Ohio State starts driving, but they were able to do it. Looking at this Big Ten now as we head into 2024, it's going to be really competitive. It's not going to be going through the schedule where you don't play a competitive game until November 11th, like Michigan did last year when they finally played Penn State. It's going to be challenging. Oregon comes in, they got a lot of juice. Ohio State has, completely filled out their roster with a lot of talent. Where does Michigan fit near the top of the Big Ten? Who do you have maybe as the favorites going in?
Yeah, I think it probably right now, if I had to put, $5 on it of who gets to the Big Ten title game in a year where divisions are finally gone, thank God. I think I probably look at Oregon and Ohio State right now, just because there's not enough at quarterback for Michigan yet for me to feel comfortable putting them in that elite category. But I put them right below Oregon and Ohio State in terms of teams that could certainly challenge for the Big Ten title game. To me, the thing about Michigan's quarterback situation is if they choose Alex Orji, I think the offense looks very, very different than if they choose Jack Tuttle or Davis Warren. And that doesn't mean there's no overlap. Again, I thought that was a pretty good point that you and Anthony made on the podcast last week, is that even if Orji is the number 2 guy or the number 3, whatever it is, he's probably going to get mixed in certain ways so that they can use his athleticism, which I think is important to remember. But I just think with so many unproven passers right now, and without a ton of proven running back depth beyond Donovan Edwards, and with Donovan Edwards having some injury problems throughout his career, I just don't have as much confidence in Michigan's passing attack right now. But I think Oregon and Ohio State are probably going to go into the season as the 2 teams highest ranked in the AP poll and things like that. But I also am still uncertain about what Will Howard's going to look like at Ohio State. I was down there for their spring game, and you look at him physically and he looks like Cam Newton, and you look at him move and you can see like why Ohio State would be interested in a guy like this. But, completion percentage leaves something to be desired. He's learning a new system. He's transitioning to new teammates. It's hard to say exactly how that will go. Kyle McCord was good enough last year to get them to within a touchdown or 2 of Michigan, but didn't
on the road. Yeah.
They were
a great team,
but ultimately wasn't good enough to get them to the Big Ten title game or a playoff. So you would think that they believe Will Howard or Devin Brown is going to be better than that, but until you see it, you still don't know. And then Oregon, I just love Dylan Gabriel. I think that was an extremely smart pickup for them in the transfer portal. Dylan Gabriel is the kind of guy where I think you add a guy like that to your team, and it's a really smart college football move. Dylan Gabriel is almost certainly not going to be a first-round pick next year because he's under 6 feet tall, and he's already, in his 6th year of college football. So he'll be 23, 24 years old by the time he gets drafted. So I would be surprised if Dylan Gabriel develops into a first-round pick, but I don't think there's any question that in terms of returning talent at the quarterback position and proven talent, he's probably among the top 5 or 6 guys in the country in terms of what you're going to get and you've seen it on tape. And he's done it in multiple systems, so he already knows how to learn a new offense. And so I just think adding him was extremely smart for Oregon to go through and be a contender right away in 2024. And then Michigan, I just don't know what that offense is going to look like. And I think there's such variance between what Orji might be and what one of the more traditional passing quarterbacks might be that it's hard to say. But I think Michigan's defense is going to be darn good. I think they're going to be really, really good right away. And even though the offensive line is going to have to change a bunch of faces, and even though there's maybe a little bit of concern at how it looks at tackle, I just have enough faith in Grant Newsome and Sherrone Moore to figure it out with the bodies that they have and the player development that they've shown over the last few years, to where I don't think that will be a big issue. To me, it's quarterback play, wide receiver, and whether Donovan Edwards can stay healthy. Those are kind of my 3 biggest questions about Michigan's offense. But I firmly put Michigan third, maybe just fighting for second right now in that Big Ten hierarchy. But it would not surprise me at all if they made it back to the Big Ten title game. I think they have enough talent to do it. I just don't know if that talent is proven yet. So that's kind of what I'm curious to see.
No, I think that's very fair. You mentioned being down in Columbus for the spring game. Obviously, they boosted their roster. It might have been Josh Pate, said it was. I don't want to credit this to him if he didn't say it, but somebody that was listened to on some sort of clip. It's the best roster money can buy, that sort of thing. They bring in Caleb Downs. Chip Kelly's there to run the offense now. I know it was going to be Bill O'Brien. What'd you learn about Ohio State this spring, and what differences maybe are there between what they were last year and what they might be this year?
Well, I think one of the things that's going to be really interesting to watch is whether or not they run the football a little bit more than they have throughout Ryan Day's tenure. And part of that is because of a change in play caller, with Ryan Day finally giving up play calling after wrestling with that decision for a couple of seasons. He brings in Chip Kelly, as you noted, who was the head coach at UCLA, who leaves his position as a head coach to come be a coordinator at Ohio State on a big money contract. And I think with Chip Kelly's background, both at UCLA and at Oregon and in the NFL with the Eagles and the 49ers, he's going to make an effort to run the ball, and he's going to find ways to run the ball pretty effectively if his track record is any indication. And so the fact that they have TreVeyon Henderson and then brought in Quinshon Judkins from Ole Miss, the top running back in the transfer portal, I think the two of them could be, among, if not the best 1-2 punch out there at the running back position. And so with Ryan Day and his propensity to throw the ball, with that no longer being in the play calling mold as much now, he's still going to be on the headset, still going to have the opportunity to influence things. But if Chip has, the ability to run the ball more the way Chip has throughout his own career, what does that mean for Ohio State? Does it take pressure off Will Howard? Do they come across as a more balanced team on offense than they have in the past few seasons? Because there have been games where TreVeyon Henderson looks great, and then there's other games where he doesn't get a lot of touches, and then there's other games where he gets banged up because, just like Donovan Edwards, he's been injury prone as well. And so I think if they have 2 guys that are at a high level, can they run the ball a little bit more? So that was one thing that was a topic of discussion around their spring game when I was down there. And then the other side of the ball is just how good they think this defense is going to be. One of the things that they did really, really well, in addition to getting guys out of the portal, high-level guys like we talked about, they also kind of did what Michigan did after the loss to TCU, which is convince guys to come back that were already in the program. And they did a really, really good job convincing 5, 6, 7, 8 key guys on defense that probably weren't going to be first or second round picks, but almost certainly were going to be picked in rounds 3 through 7. They got a lot of those guys to come back for another season. And so there is a strong belief in Columbus that this defense is going to be very, very good, very, very talented. And if not the best in the country, certainly one of the best in the country. So that could potentially take a little bit of pressure off of Will Howard or whoever wins that quarterback competition as well. So those are kind of the 2 big talking points that were discussed while I was down there. It's, will this offense look a little bit different with Chip Kelly calling the plays rather than Ryan Day? And on the defensive side of the ball, just how much anticipation and excitement there is because they got all of their guys to come back for another season and give this another go and see if they can snap the losing streak to Michigan.
Yeah, I think people forget, too, how good that defense was last year. But now they have guys returning, guys coming in. I think Sonny Styles probably in a better position that suits him a little bit more at linebacker now as opposed to in the defensive backfield. So that's why when the graphic came out, okay, Michigan had 13 draft picks. Ohio State had, 5, 6, or 7? I forget what it was. no victory lap needed for Michigan fans because a lot of those guys are back in Columbus, like you said, just like how Michigan did a year ago when they had a lot of draft picks, but they could have had even more if some of the guys that could have would have decided to come out. One of the last things I got for you here is an ongoing debate that we've had is what's the second toughest game on Michigan's schedule? I assume that you agree the toughest is heading down to Columbus at the end of November, but it could be different. Is it a home game against Oregon? Is it a road game against Washington? Is it a home game against Texas? Is it a home game against USC? Or take it wherever. I mean, if you think at Indiana might be the trap game, then go ahead.
Oh man, well, you never go into Champaign against Brett Bielema's Hog Mollies and expect it to be an easy game. But no, I think it's week 2 against Texas, and I think it's partly because of the timing of that game. I just think that there's so many things that Michigan is going to figure out over the course of the first 4, 5, or 6 games that it's unreasonable to think that they would have them all figured out by week 2. The same with any team. It's not just Michigan, but whether they're still uncertain about the quarterback situation, whether they're still trying to figure out who their third wide receiver is, whether they're shuffling through corners like we talked about or safeties to figure out what the right rotation is there, whether they're still tinkering with playing time, because I think one of the storylines that we haven't discussed yet on defense is that even though their top 2 edge rushers in Josiah Stewart and Derek Moore are, I think, going to be excellent, I don't think there's as much depth at the edge rusher position as they've had in recent years. So how many snaps can you play your starters if you want to play them more than you played guys in the last couple of seasons? So I think there's a lot of questions that just need to be answered over the course of a month or so. And I just don't think all of them will be answered by the time Texas comes in. Now, Texas, on the other hand, has their own questions to answer. And you and I are recording this on Monday afternoon. Just this morning, I was working on something that will probably be out either by the time this comes out or within a couple of days, where it was talking about the question was in one of our roundtables over at Fox Sports, and it was talking about which of the 3 Heisman caliber quarterbacks, Dylan Gabriel, Quinn Ewers, or Carson Beck, is most likely to struggle this season if you had to pick one. Now, I don't think any of those 3 guys are really going to struggle, but I picked Ewers just because I think the biggest question that Texas has to answer is, what do you do without your top 5 receivers from a year ago? That's 3 top receivers being gone, 2 top tight ends being gone, and a running back being gone. So top 6 in terms of overall production in the receiving department. And what does that look like? Are they in sync yet? Is that offense ready to go? So I think there's questions about every team early in the season. And so I just think that's probably the toughest game because it's a great opponent that is probably going to be in contention for the CFP or at least challenging for it. It's early in the season. When there are still questions to be answered. And I just think the environment is going to be off the charts because I assume Texas fans will probably travel pretty well. Now, obviously, still going to be way, way, way overwhelming pro-Michigan crowd as you would expect at Michigan Stadium. But that atmosphere is just going to be off the charts. So that game is fascinating to me. Otherwise, I would have chosen the Oregon game. But I think with enough games in between the start of the season and that Oregon game, there's enough time there to sort through some things and figure some things out that I just think the early nature of Texas and the caliber of opponent of Texas creates a little bit of a bigger challenge earlier in the season.
No, I agree with you. That's what I have, and it's because of timing for sure. They're going to be the question marks. And like you said, every team's going to have them. I will say, you look at Michigan's schedule there, Fresno State is a decent challenge.
Yeah.
It's going to be a challenge. If you get through them, it's a decent team to play before the teams you're going to have to play next because they're going to throw the ball out. They ranked 21st in the country last year in passing offense. Then you're going to face, a really good quarterback in Quinn Ewers. Their passing attack, I still think they have weapons. And then you get USC, you get Washington a couple weeks after that. Like the Fresno State game is going to kind of set the tone and at least be a measuring stick coming out of fall camp for Aamir Hall and these guys that are making the transition, or a Jair Hill who's trying to transition from reserve to starter, that sort of thing. Spoiler alert. I'm going to ask Michael now about Curb Your Enthusiasm. If you haven't watched the end, the last season, or if you're like, hey, I'm in season 2, a lot of people are catching up and everything. Spoiler, just turn it off now, or skip ahead. But your thoughts on the finale? I thought it was a beautiful ending, tying it together with Seinfeld. I'm a huge Seinfeld guy as well, and it was great. I mean, it was a great season overall. Maybe not like super classic in terms of some of the episodes you think about and remember, looking back, but I loved it.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to end these shows well, right? Like it's so hard when the show's been on for so long, whether it's a comedy or a drama or anything. I mean, shoot, that's why so many millions of people were up in arms about the last season of Game of Thrones, right? But with Curb, I just thought it was really nicely done. I liked the callback to some of the old characters from the show, bringing them back in for the finale. I thought that was really nice. I thought tying it in with Seinfeld was good. I think as much as I would love Curb to continue because I thought it was the funniest show going, basically through its whole run, I think losing some of the characters, Marty Funkhauser, who had passed away, Richard Lewis, who passed away after this season was completed, but before it finished airing, I just think the show wasn't going to quite be the same anymore. And I think it was time for it to end. But man, I mean, just what a run. I know it started in like 99. It was on and off since then, but just a show unlike anything else. And, we'll have to find something new to discuss on Mondays when I happen to be crossing through Ann Arbor now, because we won't have any Curb Your Enthusiasm episodes on Sunday evenings. But just what a show. What a show.
I know. It was incredible. And the fact that it transcended all these different eras where, like you said, I think 99 was probably the pilot, or it was a special, maybe not a pilot, something like that. And the fact that the same type of comedy can be funny for that long, 25, 26 years is extremely impressive. Maybe one of the most impressive things in comedy history. I'm not a comedy historian, but at least in my limited knowledge of it, it was incredible. So totally agree, Michael. Love when you come by Ann Arbor for Michigan coverage. As always, love seeing you at the games. You do a great job for Fox Sports. Did a great job covering Michigan on the beat when you were there as well. One of the good dudes in the industry. Thanks so much. Follow Michael's coverage at foxsports.com. He's also on Twitter. At Michael_Cohen13. That's Cohen on the last name. And appreciate you, man.
Yeah, thank you. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me, Clayton. I appreciate it. And looking forward to listening to more episodes of you guys moving forward.
All right, that's our show for today. Make sure to check us out at thewolverine.com. As always, the promo code UM1 is an exclusive offer for our podcast listeners and viewers. 2 months of premium access for just $1 at thewolverine.com. Get on our message board. Get all of our premium content. Like the video. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Pick up and pre-order your copy of the Wolverines 2024 Michigan Football Preview Magazine at thewolverineondemand.com or the link in the description. And we'll see everyone next time.